The investigation intensifies the moment Shell Brooks and Christopher Palmer are arrested. Though Shelly is not accused of physically harming the infant, detectives make clear she's being charged with first-degree cruelty to children and neglect, not because they believe she intentionally hurt him, but because no one intervened when it became clear medical help was needed. Shell is terrified. "I never hurt my baby," she insists, voice trembling. Investigators gently explain that charges arise from her inaction, failure to seek help in a crisis with devastating consequences. Meanwhile, Christopher is booked on multiple counts: cruelty to children in the first degree, felony aggravated assault, child abuse, possession of a firearm by a felon, felony murder, malice murder. His charges are intense, based not only on the infant's critical condition, but also on background information and forensic evidence. As they appear at the station, questions remain. What really happened within the walls of that RV in the days prior, and how did so much suffering go unnoticed? The detectives know the only path forward is to sit down separately with each parent. They must unravel how their lives became transient, how they funded living in an RV behind a gas station, and what rituals of control and fear shaped the family dynamic. Only by understanding the fear and coercion Shelly lived under can they begin to reconstruct what led to that night's horrors. In the hours ahead, investigators review unstable timelines: Shell's disability income, Christopher's dominance over funds, her isolation, and his paranoia. They prepare to ask tough questions about addiction, violence, and manipulation. The interrogation rooms wait. The full story is still hidden, but the detectives are ready. In the sterile interrogation room, Shelly trembles. She tells a detective haltingly that Christopher would sometimes lock her in the bathroom when she threatened to leave. According to her father, one door inside their previous camper was damaged. He said Shelly ripped the lock off in anger during a confrontation. She describes nights of being held captive, punched in the face, bound with cuffs or rope, her legs sometimes tied. She sits across from the detective and admits that Christopher would handcuff her to keep her from escaping. The investigator probes Shelly's background. She receives disability payments, but over time Christopher took control of those funds. She admits she hardly knows how much she gets monthly or where it all goes. He handles everything. She tries to explain her limited capacity, mentioning possible cognitive challenges, how she struggled to understand life decisions. The detective acknowledges her circumstances without judgment. He ponders how a woman in her state of mind could be coerced into living with a man who punished her if she questioned him. Shelly shares horrifying detail. Christopher would sometimes point a gun at her head. He warned her that if she reached out to her father or tried to leave, he'd kill him first. She recounts the time he shot the weapon inside the camper, screaming threats while standing over her. She says she wanted away, but he kept the keys and insisted she stay, promising vengeance if she defied him. Text exchanges between Shelly and Christopher's ex-girlfriend, Megan, were also discovered. Megan warned Shelly, "He's caused me hell. Be careful." Shelly says she believed Christopher had changed in the 2 years they'd been together, but now the investigators doubt that narrative. In another interview, the couple's older child says his baby brother is in the hospital because "my daddy hooped him." When asked how he was hooped, he says his father smacked him on the floor. Meanwhile, detectives obtain witness statements from neighbors. They recall seeing Shell and Christopher holding signs that said they lost their home in a fire. Some even say Shell's father told them Christopher torched that camper. But no charges were ever filed on that claim. The picture forming is clear. A relationship steeped in control, violence, manipulation, and fear. A toxic web that shielded Christopher and isolated Shelly. With each disclosure, the detectives gain more clarity. They sense Shell's fear guided every decision. But as forensic interviews progress, the full horror begins to take shape. Not just a fatal incident, but weeks of neglect, violence, abuse in every form. Attention turns to the injuries sustained by 8-month-old Cody. Medical staff at the hospital confirmed he suffered a bucket handle fracture to his leg, a specific injury consistent with deliberate shaking and high-stress acceleration of a dangling limb. This is not an accident caused by a toddler jumping in a playpen. Instead, it is an indicator of abuse. The pathologist confirms some injuries are weeks old, others fresh. Brain swelling, skull fractures, internal bruising. The prognosis is grim. In the room with Shelly, detectives asked specifically about the homemade cast on the baby's leg. Shelly had said her older child jumped into the playpen and landed on the baby, but investigators know that alone does not account for a bucket handle fracture. When pressed, Shelly says she remembers wanting to take him to the hospital, but Christopher forbade it. She presents as remorseful, visibly shaken. She says she tried to suggest medical care multiple times, but he dismissed her. He just hush-commented her, as she puts it. Meanwhile, Christopher is asked again about the fall. He describes preparing to give Cody a bath in the kitchen sink. He says he held the baby, slipped, tried to catch him but dropped him, claiming his head hit the sink edge. He says he flipped him over to clear airway, performed CPR, tapped on his chest, knees, lungs, anything to revive him. But experts on scene refute that explanation. A fall from chest height into a sink doesn't explain the wide array of injuries. Fingertip bruises, claw machine head marks, healed rashes, signs of neglect, blistered foot heels. These are not CPR artifacts. These are signs of repetitive trauma. Investigators break down the specifics. Marks on the infant's feet are inconsistent with walker scratches. Instead, they appear burn-like or inflicted with an object. Heidi, in medical records, identified them as possible lash or contact injuries. How did those appear? Shelly shrugs, says the kid's roughhouse, but she can't account for those marks. Christopher reluctantly admits he disciplined the toddler boy, his 2-year-old, explaining bruises as stuff a toddler does. When asked if the baby's injuries could have come from sibling roughhousing, his response is weak. He admits the older boys sometimes hit the infant and bang toys, but the pattern and severity raise immediate doubt. Beyond the physical trauma, detectives begin to assemble a timeline of pharmaceutical and illicit drug involvement. Shelly admits Christopher had her on meth daily in the weeks leading up to the incident. At times, he forced it into her, insisting it would make her a better mom. She describes once or twice when it burned her while they drew it with cards, lines, other times piped as hard rock. Her description of being unconscious or forgetful for days raises questions. Could she have been complicit without memory? Officers inspect the camper again, noting firearms visible within reach. Christopher's status as a convicted sex offender in New York makes possession illegal. Shelly confirms the weapons are his. She says he carried them to intimidate her and assert dominance. She says she was often locked in small rooms, handcuffed, while the gun sat maybe inches away. The picture is darker than ever. Addicts, abusers, a family held hostage. It is becoming clearer that mere confusion can no longer be used to explain away what happened to Cody. In the station, detectives present Shelly with damning medical summaries. They explain that the bucket handle fracture could only have occurred through violent acceleration of the limb. They read to her the details of internal brain hemorrhaging, healed rib bruises, raised red abrasions consistent with fingertip pressure. They show her photos of Cody's head injuries, bruising of varied ages, deep pressure impressions shaped like fingers. She breaks down crying. She says she was afraid, terrified of Christopher's reaction. She says she remembers instances where she saw bruises form but didn't dare question them. She recalls injections of meth, confiscated money, broken locks, concealed threats. She begs for help, not justice, speaking through tears. I didn't want this. I wanted him safe. The detective offers her a chance to tell her side. Her memory is fragmented. She admits. She says Christopher sometimes snapped, threw the baby against the wall, or dropped him. She says once she saw him stand over the crib, fish out a lighter or other item, and cause the baby's skin to blister. She blames herself. Maybe if I just left, he'd still be alive. The detective sympathetically but firmly explains Shelly's failure to take him to a doctor or a hospital when symptoms appeared, especially for the leg injury, constitutes neglect in the face of imminent danger. She sobs and nods. She hears that she will likely be deemed legally incompetent, but if she cooperates, her charges may remain related to neglect with no physical harm count. But investigators warn that this is not enough. The law requires separating the emotional abuse and neglect from the physical crimes. Christopher's control and violence hurt more than Cody's body. Shelly is advised that Protective Services plan to place her younger children with her family. She expresses relief but also guilt. I stayed. I went back. Maybe if I showed up more worried, someone would believe me. In the meantime, Christopher sits in another room. He is told they have a full forensic medical report. They outline injuries impossible to reconcile with accidents or rough play. They explain his charges again: aggravated assault, child abuse, murder, based on consistent evidence in his history. They reference his prior record: family violence, sex offender status, domestic abuse allegations. The implications are clear. They intend to try him on the harshest terms. Christopher swears he didn't mean to kill Cody. He repeats that he acted during panic. He believes he performed CPR badly, but the detectives press. Then why didn't you take him to the hospital earlier? Why did you avoid medical care when injuries showed? Why did you respond with violence, not help? At this point, the medical examiner's office authoritative summary is delivered. Cause of death: traumatic brain injury with complications from skull fractures. The ruling is clearly that the injuries led directly to Cody's death. Their internal team condemns emotion. The child's death is classified as homicide, not accidental. With tears in both eyes, Christopher is informed. He will be indicted for murder. Shelly will be assessed, but likely judged incompetent to stand trial. Protective Services will petition for full guardianship of the older children. His bail is denied. The detective leaves the room. Christopher is alone with the weight of his impending fate. The clock has now turned from investigation to prosecution. The teams prepare to parcel case files, submit medical exhibits, interview CPS, assemble witness statements, and release a timeline. But for Shelly and Christopher, the rest of their lives, however long or short, will hinge on indignities and revelations that twisted those final weeks together. Outside the station, law enforcement and social service agencies coordinate the immediate care of the surviving children. Shelly's extended family accepts guardianship, planning for foster care with potential long-term placement. Detectives open interviews with neighbors. Some recall signs reading "Lost House and Fire," sightings of the RV in odd locations, quiet nights disturbed by cries. None called the police at the time. The fear surrounding the couple was palpable. Child welfare workers begin their assessments, traveling through records of Shelly's disability claim, tracing Christopher's financial dominance, documenting his control over her identity, phone, access to outside help. Shelter staff note Shelly avoids eye contact, answer questions hesitantly, often deferring Christopher. Even now, weeks after his arrest, she removed herself to a safe space to help build trust. Detectives file search warrants on digital devices. Messages between Shelly and Megan reveal haunting warnings about Christopher's past. Investigators extract timestamps of games, RV stays, periods of instability. They plot a timeline: the tentative house fire rumor, 2019, the birth and death of a previous child, the RV occupancy in Peach County, the daily meth use increasing in recent months. The murder charge is formally filed. Prosecutors argue that Christopher not only caused Cody's death by violence, but also maintained an environment of neglect, abuse, and terror. They depict a pattern: threatening firearms, forced drug use, starved oversight, physical violence, withholding medical care, all culminating in one final lethal incident. Shelly's impending competency hearing is scheduled. Forensic evaluators determine whether she can meaningfully participate in her defense. Her history of intellectual disability is documented. Prosecutors confirm she may not face a criminal trial, but social services will treat her as an adult capable of consenting to child placement decisions. Throughout, detectives keep pushing on a few key unresolved threads. How did the bruises and marks form? Who handled the homemade cast? What did neighbors see at nights? Did any mother figure suspect? Why did no one call the authorities sooner? Investigators collect every scrap of evidence: photos of the RV clutter, gun shells, children's toys, homemade medical supplies, receipts for meth paraphernalia. A forensics tech begins processing DNA and fingerprints on the cast materials, on the handcuffs Christopher used on Shelly, on drug paraphernalia. They note ownership patterns, uniting items to specific hands, linking his prior sex offender registry status to the state where firearms were found. Meanwhile, in jail, Christopher's demeanor darkens. He repeatedly demands to know why they don't give him bond. He rages. He pleads to see his surviving children. He threatens self-harm. Staff separate him after each outburst. His defense attorney begins pretrial motions, challenging jurisdiction, voicing concerns about evidence chain, threatening plea discussions. Shelly, moved to mental health evaluation, begins therapy sessions. She expresses regret, sorrow, fear. She says she still loves Christopher but no longer trusts him. The path forward is uncertain. Can she gain stability for herself and her children? As autumn 2022 deepens, legal deadlines approach. Indictments, competency hearings, discovery disclosures. Investigators prepare court packages. News media begin to cover it locally. But for Shelly and Christopher, the true pattern of those months, violence, coercion, neglect, manipulation, has already been documented. The prosecution rests its case on a combination of forensic medical evidence, witness statements, and the couple's own admissions. At trial, forensic pathologists testify about the bucket handle fracture and brain hemorrhages. Burn patterns on the infant's heel are shown to be inconsistent with accidental falls. Photographs of open sores, fingertip bruises, and healing wounds across the infant's body are presented as evidence of prolonged abuse. Video snippets from the initial 911 response footage are played, revealing the chaos and confusion at the gas station that night. Detectives and paramedics testify about the conditions inside the RV, the filthy, overcrowded living space, drug use paraphernalia, open firearms, unsafe cast materials, signs of neglect on the other children, and statements overheard during the initial confrontation. Shelly's eyewitness testimony is included, acknowledging CPR attempts, pleas for help, repeated refusal to see a doctor, and the fear she lived under, locked doors, threats, control. Shelly's mental competency hearing concludes. Experts declare her incompetent to stand trial. As a result, her criminal proceedings are suspended, and she is placed under guardianship. However, her past neglect is still entered as evidence for sentencing and protective services decisions. The judge orders her participate in parenting classes, support programs, and supervise visits with the older children when they become available. Christopher's trial proceeds. The defense argues panic-induced miscalculation, lack of intent to kill. But the prosecution counters. The injuries are numerous and precise, some months old, others fresh, many inconsistent with accidents. They argue deliberate actions and neglect. They show his history of domestic violence, his criminal record, and patterns of coercion and control over Shelly. In November 2024, the jury deliberates for just an hour and a half. They return guilty on all counts: first-degree cruelty to children, aggravated assault, possession of firearm by a convicted felon, felony murder, and malice murder. The verdict is swift, a sign the evidence was compelling and cohesive. Court documents confirm he received life in prison plus 10 years with no possibility of parole. Following sentencing, protective services confirm that Shelly's 2 surviving children remain with her extended family in foster care. They affirm central custody rests with Shell's father, with supervised visits possible if Shell complies with court orders. Christopher is remanded to a state penitentiary to begin his sentence immediately. The community is shaken. Documentarians revisit the case to highlight systemic failure, the hidden signs of abuse, the importance of reporting suspected neglect. Several nonprofits begin advocating for better support for families living on disability or outside typical housing, families who can slip under the radar of social services. As the legal process closes, a quieter reckoning begins. Interviews with Shelly's family, reflections from detectives and prosecutors, statement from a medical team, and commentary on how one moment at Buc-ee's gas station revealed years of trauma. In the aftermath of trial, Shelly's family attempts to rebuild. With court-ordered support programs in place, Shell participates in trauma counseling and parenting education. She visits her surviving children under supervision, rebuilding bonds at a slow pace. Social workers monitor her living situation and therapy compliance before allowing greater freedoms. She grapples with guilt, fear, grief, and occasionally flashes of terror, reminders of captivity and coercion she endured. Meanwhile, Christopher is incarcerated. He writes notes, occasional letters, claiming innocence or at least lack of intent. He describes nightmares, regret, sorrow, but remorse is overshadowed by his absence. News coverage tracks his location, Media referred his life without parole sentence as one of the harshest in the state for child murder. Journalists analyzed systemic failures. Could earlier signs have prevented tragedy? Would neighbors have intervened if they saw odd bruising on the children? Experts argue that the medicines he forced on Shelly, the firearms in reach, the homemade plaster cast, the apartment in the shadows behind a gas station, all added layers of danger. A documentary series interviews former neighbors, childhood friends of Shelly, members of disability advocacy groups, each to shed light on how such a situation could be allowed to escalate unchecked. Shell's father gives emotional interviews describing how Shell was groomed, how Christopher isolated her from her parents, took her money, convinced her he would protect her and provide her even as he destroyed her autonomy. He speaks of the pain of losing one grandson and nearly another. Civil suits are filed too. Child welfare groups pursue guardianship-related claims. Disability advocates file complaints against county agencies, arguing that Shell's intellectual disability should have raised flags earlier. While criminal justice focused on punishment, civil proceedings now challenge prevention. In prison, Christopher's legal team files appeals, arguing procedural missteps, inadequate defense, juror bias. But appellate courts uphold the conviction, citing solid physical evidence and clear testimony. The public remains divided. Some see him as a violent predator who preyed on the vulnerable. Others argue that addiction and mental instability may have clouded judgment, but the brutality and neglect were undeniable. Meanwhile, Shell continues therapy. She expresses regret and amazement she survived. She speaks of wanting to build a stable life for the children she still has, to honor the memory of Cody, to be a voice for women trapped in controlling relationships. Advocacy organizations invite her to speak anonymously about coercive control, domestic violence, child protection, and intellectual disability rights. Detectives close their files, though the memory stays with them. Many officers talk about how this case changed their approach to suspected child abuse calls, how they now look for layered trauma, mental control, physical injury, domestic coercion, patterns rather than single incidents. In local press, one editorial reads, "In this RV, pain and desperation lived unnoticed, but the system eventually held someone accountable. The question is, how can we prevent such horror from staying invisible in the future?" Years later, the legacy of baby Cody's death lingers. Legislation is proposed in Georgia to better monitor families on disability with dependent children, require welfare check-ins, and train disability service workers to identify signs of coercive domestic abuse. Shelly's case becomes a reference in law schools for discussions of child neglect, coerced control, intellectual disability, and domestic violence law crossover. Shell's older children grow up in foster care with their grandmother. They visit Shell under supervision. Shell, though emotionally fragile, attends therapy and parenting classes, striving to earn the right to rebuild a relationship. She works part-time with a nonprofit, helping women escape abusive relationships. In interviews, she says the worst part was not just violence, but fear that stopped her from seeking help. She pledges to warn others. Christopher remains incarcerated, his appeals denied. Occasionally, media note when he's moved to a different facility or applies for sentence review, which is always refused. He remains on Georgia's sex offender registry as well, a reminder of his criminal past. Prison filings indicate no possibility of parole. His legal team is silent. His public statements are rare, mostly defiant, claiming misinterpretation, not remorse. Advocacy leaders highlight Shell's journey, how her intellectual disability and isolation were exploited. They lobby for public policy changes, mandated reporting, better coordination between disability services and child protection, education for caregivers about domestic coercion. Cody's case stands as tragic proof that neglect isn't always passive. It's often enforced by control. Documentary filmmakers released a special episode in 2025 titled Behind Gas Station Walls, featuring interviews with investigators, Shell's father, disability rights attorneys, and medical experts. They reconstruct the case through timeline graphics, home video-style shots of the RV, now demolished, and courtroom footage. They dedicate the episode to Cody's memory. Prosecutors reflect afterward, "We couldn't save him, but we can make sure his name stands for accountability." They release a statement urging communities to take bruises seriously and to remember, Sometimes the scariest danger is not what you see, but what you're afraid to speak about. In the end, 8-month-old Cody's story becomes more than tragedy. It becomes a warning, a catalyst for change. It reminds us that love is not always obvious, but fear often speaks louder. And for Shell and the children who survive, rebuilding becomes both a redemption and a resolve. To protect, to heal, and to never remain silent again.